Good evening, everybody, and welcome to tonight's webinar, part of the 20th anniversary of Marine National Park series of webinars Parks Victoria hosting, celebrating our magnificent Marine National Park system through the latter part of 2022. Hello and welcome. Tonight's presentation is also part of the Victorian Nature Festival, and we're delighted to be able to make a contribution to looking at marine biodiversity here in Victoria. And tonight's presentation will be a fantastic opportunity to explore what that actually means in terms of our local environments. My name is Mark Rodrigue. I'm the Program Leader for Marine and Coasts at Parks Victoria, and it'll be my pleasure to be hosting you this evening. Before we begin tonight's presentation in earnest, I'd like to just start by paying my respects to traditional owners across Victoria, wherever you might be. In my own particular case, I'm speaking to you from Wadawurrung country on the Bellarine Peninsula. And we pay our respects to traditional owners past, present, emerging across the state. Tonight's event, as you know, is being hosted on a Teams live event, and if you're not familiar with this particular format, it's pretty much like a Zoom or most other sort of online meetings you'll find. There's a couple of functions though, which I think it's worthwhile pointing out to you that you can help to make this this session a little bit more interactive. The first thing, if you look, and it depends on whether you're looking on a web browser or on your phone, there's a Q&A button. It might be up the top of your screen if you're on a PC or a laptop, or alternatively, there might be three little dots down the bottom of the screen if you're on a handheld device. But the reason for pointing this out is we do have a question and answer function within that you can use to both make some comments, say what you want to say. If you've got particular questions you'd like to ask Michael, we'll do our best to try and get through as many questions as possible towards the end of the session. But also if you've got some other things that you want to say, or you like something that's happening or been said, please feel free to use that functionality to just make it a little bit more interactive. Right now, I'll invite you though, if you'd like to just say to everybody who's joining us online, and we have over 500 people registered for tonight, hopefully quite a few of those will be actually attending. And importantly to note that this session is actually being recorded, so that if you are unable to make it, we'll certainly make that available on Parks Victoria's website very, very shortly in the coming days. Let's turn now our attention to tonight's presentation. I'm delighted tonight to have Dr. Michael Sams, who's the Parks Victoria Manager of the Marine and Coastal Science and Programs Unit, actually presenting for us on something that he knows an awful lot about, and that's biodiversity and how our marine protected area systems actually help to protect and safeguard our extraordinary biodiversity here in Victoria. Michael's a marine ecologist. He's been working with Parks Victoria for coming up to nearly 2 years, maybe not quite 2 years, but getting relatively at least a year and a half, and does a great job in looking after our small marine and coastal team. So I'm going to, Michael, if you can just flick your camera and your presentation on, please, that would be great. I will then send you to the into the queue and just get you to start by, if you wouldn't mind just reopening your presentation now. All right, folks, well, without further ado, I'd like to introduce you all to Dr. Michael Sams, who's going to take us exploring marine biodiversity. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Mark, and thanks for that introduction, and thanks for joining me, everyone. So this evening, we're going to explore Victoria's spectacular and amazing marine biodiversity. Before I begin, I'd just like to pay my respects to the traditional owners on the land that we're meeting on today. So I'm transmitting to you from Wurundjeri country, but we're going out to lands all across the state, and in particular I'd also like to acknowledge and recognise that many of our traditional owners and First Nations people living along the coast have had that connection to our sea country for tens of thousands of years, and pay my respects to their elders, both past, present and emerging. So this month is actually National Biodiversity Month, and that means that what we're doing is celebrating the plants and animals, including those that live under the marine environment. So before we get into it, I think it's important that we talk about what is biodiversity. So biodiversity is a variety of all life forms on Earth. It's an all-encompassing word, and it includes everything from plants to algae to the fungi, so things like mushrooms, animals and bacteria, as well as a whole range of other organisms that don't necessarily fall into those categories. It also includes the communities and the ecosystems that we live in. So by community, what we mean is where we have populations of different species that all coexist and interact together. And then when you include the non-living environment, so things like the rock, the soil, the substrate, temperature, water, we have the ecosystem and the non-living things that they provide as well, like the air we breathe. So unfortunately, across the globe, what we are seeing is a dramatic decline in biodiversity, something that parallels what we saw when the dinosaurs went extinct millions of years ago. But in this case, it's largely been driven by human-induced changes to the environment. So things like habitat loss, the spread of invasive species, and modification of the environment. So that's why it's really important, I think, that we continue to recognise and celebrate biodiversity for its importance to our lives, and also recognise the need and the importance of protecting that biodiversity. So in Victoria, we have spectacular and unique marine biodiversity. I think there's a perception out there that all the great marine biodiversity is found in the tropical waters on places like the Great Barrier Reefs, but it's just simply not the case. We know that in Victoria, or in Southern Australia, I should say, there are well over 14,000 species that live in our waters alone. And so in recognition of this, and also recognising that we need to do a lot to ensure that our unique biodiversity is protected. Around 20 years ago, Victoria created a network of highly protected no-take marine national parks and sanctuaries. So the aim of our marine national park and sanctuary network was to protect and preserve representative examples of Victoria's marine biodiversity and the ecological processes that support that biodiversity for future generations. So if we look across this map here, which is hopefully coming up to you in time with how I'm speaking, this is Victoria's system of marine protected areas. So our marine protected area system spans from the far east of Victoria, Cape Howe here in the far east, all the way over to Discovery Bay in the west. It also goes into our three major embayments, Port Phillip Bay, Western Port and Corner Inlet. Now, it's not shown on the map here, but Victoria is basically divided into what we call marine bioregions, and there are 5 major marine bioregions. One of them starts in Cape Howe over here and spans close to the Prom. This is known as the twofold bioregion. There's another bioregion that wraps around Wilson's Promontory down here, known as the Flinders bioregion. There's Central Bass Strait bioregion here, and then there's an Otway bioregion that extends and covers most of the west coast, as well as our bays. And so when we set up this area, the marine national parks and the marine sanctuaries, the idea is that we set up parks across the state so they'd capture biodiversity that represents what we find in each of those bioregions. So what we have, about 5.6 of the state is protected by marine national parks and sanctuaries, and these are the dark blue squares and dots here. And these are set up specifically for the purpose of protecting biodiversity. So they're no-take, the highest level of protection, not allowed fish there, no resource extraction is allowed. They're there as sanctuaries for our biodiversity. And then we also have what we call multi-use marine protected areas. So these have names like marine parks, marine and coastal parks. And these are the light blue areas you can see here in Corner Inlet and some along the coast of the Prom here. We do allow some recreational and commercial fishing to occur in these areas, but they've still been set up with that primary purpose of protecting biodiversity, and they protect around 6.4% of the state's waters. So all up, about 11% of the state is protected in our marine protected area network. So let's explore Victoria's marine biodiversity. So when I was putting this webinar together, it was quite a challenge to work out how best to go about describing Victoria's marine biodiversity. There isn't enough time to go into detail about each of the thousands of species that we find in Victoria. 14,000, we could spend all year, a whole university course, just examining them. So the approach I'm going to take today is we'll go through a journey down through Victoria's major underwater ecosystem types. We'll meet some of the key species that we find in these ecosystems, and really just some of the key examples of the species that typify those ecosystems. We'll also examine how marine diversity changes across these habitats and marine national parks. And lastly, we'll learn about how biodiversity has been protected in our marine national parks and sanctuary. And so there's going to be lots of nice videos and images to showcase our diversity. And so hopefully now I'm done with the boring slides with bullet points and text and things like that. So to begin with, what I want to do is just actually show you a video that showcases the type of diversity that we find in Victoria's marine environment. And so hopefully this is going to work. Yell out mark if it's not coming through. So what you're seeing here now, hopefully, is what most Victorians will be familiar with when they think of our marine and coastal environment. So people know the coast by its beaches and from seeing the marine environment from above the water, but without a lot of idea of the incredible diversity that we find when we go below the water. So when we do dive down under the water, we find really rich and diverse ecosystems. So Victoria has a temperate or a seasonal and cool marine climate. So we don't have things like coral reefs. What we have are environments like this. So these extensive underwater forests that you've just seen here, they're made up of a diverse variety of seaweeds and other marine plants. They're home to diverse assemblages of fishes and invertebrates, as well as for larger animals like the seals that just popped in the shot before. As you dive down deeper, where there's less light to support seaweeds, we get these extensive reef ecosystems that we call sponge gardens. So they're made up of animals that are a bit like coral in our environment, but they're often very distantly related to coral. So sponge gardens are home to a huge diversity of fishes and invertebrates as well. We're seeing some examples of those here, like this Port Jackson shark, blue devil, southern blue devil here. And so what you're looking at here are what the reef ecosystems that grow on the rocky surfaces. So they need those hard surfaces to live on. But we have lots of other important habitats in our marine environments and captured in our marine national parks and sanctuaries. So the water itself is a really important habitat. It's critical for pelagic animals like those big schooling fish, the Australian salmon, and these dolphins that you can see here. And then we also have extensive areas of seagrass beds that act like the meadows of the ocean. And they tend to grow on that softer, sandier substrate. And they're again home to a different selection of plants and animals that are ideally suited to living in those conditions. Like this right here, and here's our state emblem, the weedy sea dragon. And so lastly, there are the large sandy expanses that actually form extensive habitat throughout our marine environments. And so what I'll do now is I'll go into more detail about each of these major ecosystem types and talk about some of the creatures that we find in them. So to begin with, we'll look at our beautiful underwater forests. So these are rocky reef areas that are dominated by seaweeds or macroalgae. I'll just refer to them as plants because macroalgae can sometimes be a bit of a mouthful. So I'll call them plants for simplicity, as that's effectively what they are. There are probably a few very science-minded types who might be disagreeing with that. So I'm just using this in the loosest term possible. These are the creatures, the plants that absorb sunlight, much like our plants do on the land. So they're very similar in function to our forests on the land. They absorb sunlight to produce their food, their sugars and oxygen that then oxygenates the ocean around them. They cycle nutrients, they provide protection to the coast. And so they provide these really important ecosystem services for us, as well as the creatures that live within them. And so our underwater forests are found in the shallow areas of rocky reef where there's enough sunlight to support plants. And so that's usually above 30 meters depth, but they can extend down to 60 meters depth in the right environments. So there are three really major distinct groups of algae that are found in our rocky reefs, and I'll talk through each of them in the slides to come. But first of all, I'll talk about the most conspicuous of these groups, which is the brown algae. And the brown algae includes the large kelps and the seaweeds. And these are effectively the canopy formers in our reef ecosystem. So these are tall species that they create extensive underwater forests. The canopy formers in Victoria actually aren't particularly diverse. So there are really 3 to 4 major species of canopy forming brown algae on our reefs. The most common of these is the golden kelp, which is Aclonia radiata, is its species name. This is our most widespread and abundant species that we find on our moderately exposed reef. It has these flat tooth-like blades that usually form, and it usually forms these dense, really low beds that are really critical habitat for lots of species. It grows to the greatest depths of our canopy forming brown algae. So it usually grows down to about 30 meters, but sometimes as deep as 40 meters. This is a really common species that you'll find washed up on the beach in those big piles of seaweed after a storm. The other really common species of seaweed of canopy formers that we find is this algae called Crayweed, or Philospora comosa is its scientific name. It has, unlike Aclonia, it has these thin blades and these float-like blades, so they're like little balloons filled with gas, and that allows this species to stand upright in the water. So it actually forms, when the tide's high enough, these quite erect, upright stands of forest, a lot more like what we're used to seeing on the land with the trees. It's a slightly larger species than Aclonia, and it loves these wave-swept and higher energy reef environments, and it has a shallower depth range to Aclonia. So what's often really common when you're diving on these reefs is to find a band of crayweed in the shallower, more wave-exposed areas of reef, and beneath that a band of golden kelp, where as you get deeper, where there's less wave energy and it's more sheltered. Lastly, our major canopy former is this species here, the giant kelp, Macrocystis pyrifera. So this species is no longer very common around Victoria. There are anecdotal reports, including from Mark, who just provided the introduction here, of there being extensive forests of this species in places like Port Phillip Heads, and all along the open coast of Western Victoria. But now all remains of this species are isolated stands along the western coast, including in some of our marine sanctuaries, and then the odd individual popping up here and there. In places like Tasmania, and even over in California, this species formed extensive, huge areas of forest. And these have also been in decline in Tasmania. I think in Tasmania, they're down to about 20% of what it formerly was. So this species also likes the moderately exposed reefs to depths about 30 meters. It has these long blades that you can see in the picture here. And it has floats as well, like Philospora camosa, so it stands really tall in the water and provides that really important vertical structure that creates the underwater forests. It's also a really big species, so it can grow to about 20 meters in Victoria, but there are records elsewhere of it growing to 34 meters, and I think the officially biggest record is around 60 meters just for one plant. So you can imagine it's a little bit like something like the mountain ash forests of our kelp reefs. So the canopy formers aren't the only brown algae. There are around 260 species of brown algae in southern Australia, and about 60% of those species are only found in southern Australia. So that makes our brown algae quite unique to this region. There's one group of genus called Systophora, which are likened to the eucalypts of Victoria because they're so typical of our brown algal reef, but they're also unusual. You don't find them in many other parts of the world. And so that means they're really quite unique to our region. The brown algae that aren't canopy forming, these understory species, are often form these really important short low-lying reefs or really dense understory vegetation. And they have quite complicated structure. So you have some plants that have these zigzagging branches with leaves and floats all on the one plant. There are other types of brown algae that are flat and leafy. And there are others that almost look like underwater succulents. And so they form this really complicated, quite important habitat. So lots of species use these as refuges from predators and homes to live in. So the next major group, very distantly related to the brown algae, are the red algae. So these are called red algae, as you can imagine, because the plants are often coloured red, like in the image you can see here. However, they can vary from red to brown to green and even black for some species. Identifying these species can be really difficult, often requires quite a high level of expertise. And so the main feature that distinguishes red algae from the other groups of algae, so I just talked about the browns, I'll talk about the greens next, is the type of photosynthetic pigment that they have. So they have chlorophyll A and chlorophyll D, as well as some other pigments that are unique to them, and they use that to turn sunlight into energy. The other brown algae and green algae don't have the same combination of pigments, but the type of pigments that red algae have also allows them to access sunlight at much greater depths than the brown and the green algae. So it's quite common for red algae to be the dominant plant at depths below 30 meters and also down to 60 meters in the right conditions. So this is a really important group of plants for those animals that live in the deeper reefs where they provide important food and habitat and where you don't get those big brown algae growing. So the awesome thing about red algae is that Victoria is a hotspot of biodiversity for red algae. So around 800 of the world's 4,500 red algal species that have been recorded in science are found in southern Australia. And of those 800, about 70% are found nowhere else in the world. So we actually have the largest region of biodiversity for red algae anywhere in the world in southern Australia, and Victoria in particular is a really important biodiversity hotspot for the red algae. So the third major group of marine algae are the green algae. These are the close relatives of the land plants, and they share a common ancestor with the land plants, so they have the same pigments as land plants, chlorophyll A and B. For the green algae, there are around 130 species in Victoria, and around 30% of them are only found here. So they're, I guess, a bit more of a cosmopolitan species. They tend to be smaller than the brown algae, and they're often easier to eat, more palatable. So they're a really important food source for a number of grazers. They aren't typically the dominant species that you find on reefs, particularly in the greater depths, and they're found more as understory species, but there are areas that could be quite dominant, particularly on some shallow intertidal reefs and shallow, less exposed reefs where you get dense areas of green algae. So our underwater forests also provide critical habitat for a range of animals that live in very close association with algae, and so they have their own characteristic animal diversity. So One major group of animals that I'll talk about throughout this presentation, what we call the mobile macroinvertebrates. So these are animals that can move, they're mobile, but they don't have backbone. So whereas we belong to a group of animals called vertebrates, we have a backbone. Things like birds, fish, amphibians, reptiles are all vertebrates. All the other animals are considered macroinvertebrates. They don't have backbones. This includes major groups like the mollusks, so that's the slugs, the snails, and the squid. Echinoderms, so that's the sea stars and sea urchins belong to that group, things like that. Crustaceans, which has things like the crab, lobster, and then there are a range of other animals that are all very distantly related. So in our underwater forests, there's a really important group of herbivorous mobile invertebrates that are a really intrinsic part of those underwater forests. They really characterize those forests. And there are a huge variety of these, and I don't have the time to go into all of the different species. So I just want to show you a few key examples of the types of animals that rely on our kelp forests or our underwater forests and that live there. So a classic example of this are the abalone that many of you will know about. So they're effectively large marine snails, and they love to live in rocks and crevices. These are really important grazers on our reefs. Their favorite food is driftweed algae. So that's algae that's detached from the reefs and drifts on the currents. They feed on this by catching algae between their shell. They clamp on it between their shell and foot. So the foot is this bit that's attached to the rock here, and obviously that's their shell. And then they'll just munch on the algae while they've got it clamped down. Other snails are also a really important component of our underwater forests. So these can be really important grazers that are often found living on top of algae and on the fronds of algae. And therefore, they're really important for the health of these larger algae species. They keep their blades clean, and they stop other epiphytic plants from covering them too much and in taking the sunlight away from them that they need to feed. We also have these really brightly coloured sea slugs called nudibranchs all through our underwater forests. And these are really important herbivores, a bit like slugs in our garden. So the bright colours of these nudibranchs often signify that they're not good to eat or they're poisonous. So a neat thing that these animals do is they'll often incorporate the chemical defences of what they're preying on. So whether that be algae or other animals that they're preying on, they incorporate that into their bodies. And that provides them with a level of protection, so they don't taste good or they may contain poisonous chemicals that are poisonous to things that might prey on them. And that bright colour is often a warning to other species to stay away. The group of animals called the sea urchins, and this is just one example here, are really important grazers in the underwater forest. They could be quite voracious when they graze, and they're capable of eating large macroalgae to the extent that they can reduce areas of reef to barren areas that are devoid of vegetation. And so if they occur in high enough numbers, they can be a problem, but they are a natural part of the ecosystem. This talk that I'm giving today is part of a series that we've been putting together relating to our marine environment because we're coming up to the 20th anniversary, and Mark put together a talk that's available online a few weeks ago that was actually talking in more detail about some of the issues and how we're managing urchins in Victoria. So worth checking that out if you have the inclination and the time. So of course, there are also the predators of the herbivorous invertebrates. And so these are animals like the large sea stars and the rock lobsters, and they will prey on a wide range of different invertebrates. What we tend to find with these larger predators is that they're less reliant on just kelp forests, less so than these grazers. And so they will move between habitats wherever they can find prey, but a really common and really important integral part of our underwater systems are these large predatory species because they keep the grazer numbers under control so that we have good healthy vegetation there. So similarly, there's a whole cohort and species of fish that are closely associated with our underwater forests. So the number of fish that inhabit our underwater forests are again also too numerous to go through here. So I'll just go through a few key examples. The interesting thing I think about the herbivorous fish is that they're really reliant on algal reefs for their food and habitat. So we often find a lot of fish that we call reef attached, and so they are pretty specific to the sorts of habitats and the types of species that we find on the reefs. And a nice example of this is this fish that you can see here called a herring kale. So it's quite a common fish to observe on our algal reefs, but it feeds on the golden kelp that you can see here. And you commonly see it swimming through kelp beds, and it has a really nice way of swimming that almost mimics the sway of the kelp. It's got kind of a serpentine way of sleeping. And the neat thing about this fish is it belongs to a group of fish called the wrasse. And that means that the females change sex and colour when they attain a large enough size. So the female of this species is kind of an olive, greeny, mottled, speckled colour, while the males are this deep dark blue that have this almost black with bright blue stripes on the tail. And the photo here may not do justice to it, but really quite a beautiful fish to see underwater. Scaly fin are another really cool fish that can be seen on most reefs. These fish are territorial, so they maintain a little area that they graze on fastidiously, and they often create the appearance of a little moan patch on the reef where they are, because they keep it the algal levels down so low. But they're well known for chasing other fish and even divers away from their little territorial patch. And then we also get like the large schooling herbivorous fish like these zebrafish, which are shown here. And they're a bit like similar to the grazing herds that we see on land. They move through large areas and they'll graze on the seaweed. And so interestingly, the diversity of fish grazers isn't all that high compared to what we see when we're on the land. And no one's really unpacked exactly why that is, but that's a pattern that we see. And of course, there are a whole suite of really important carnivores that we find in our kelp forests. And these are typically what we call invertebrate. So they're there feeding on the macroinvertebrates that you find there. And some colourful and cool examples of these types of fish are things like the Port Jackson shark, which is quite a common one to see, but really cool fish to see swimming around. And then the brightly coloured fish like the senator wrasse and these horseshoe leatherjacket are really important carnivores. So there's a whole broad range of carnivorous fish beyond the leatherjackets and wrasse, things with names like morwongs, perch and sea scorpions and things like that. And so while kelp forests are really important hunting grounds for them, they will tend to move outside of kelp forests into other habitats in search of their prey, so a little bit less attached than the herbivorous fish are to underwater forests. So when you put all this together, this is what our underwater forests look like. So I'll just share another video, which hopefully will work, and hopefully you'll see some of these characters I've just described. I forgot to mute the music, but hopefully that's pleasant enough and coming through. But yeah, here you can see dense underwater forest, tons of fish schooling in them. We saw a little nudibranch just before. This species here is called the bull kelp, which I haven't talked about. But if you're ever wondering what that big kelp is in the intertidal where it's really wavy, it's often that bull kelp there. And yeah, there's some nice seal loving that habitat. Okay, so moving on from the underwater forest, as you move deeper into the water, there's not enough sunlight for algae to survive and grow. And so the underwater forests get replaced by what we call sponge gardens. So sponge garden is a pretty loose term for what we actually find on these reefs. So sponges, like you can see here in this image, these tall things are sponges. They're often the really large and obvious habitat forming creatures that you find in these areas. But sponge gardens are formed from a huge range of very, very distantly related species. And these are our equivalent to coral reefs effectively. So we don't have hard corals down here. Instead, sponge gardens have a totally different diversity of animals. But they form this really complex three-dimensional structure, much like a forest does, that supports a huge variety of mobile fish and invertebrates. It's really hard to put an accurate estimate on the diversity of these sponge reefs, but we estimated there are about 4,000 plus species, and of them about 22%, so about a quarter to over half of them are unique to the region of Southern Australia, and that varies depending on which group that you look at. So the major habitat forming organisms on these reefs are what we call the sessile animals. So these are creatures that are all animals like us, so they have animal cells, but they live permanently attached to hard surfaces like rocky reef, and they can't get up and move. And so some key examples of the sessile invertebrates are the sponges. So the sponges shown here, these are very simple animals with a very primitive structure. They don't have many different types of cells in their bodies. They grow in a range of shapes and sizes, but all of them have this system of tunnels and chambers all throughout their bodies that waters pass through, and they extract food from that water, what we call filter feeders. We also have a huge diversity of really brilliant and beautifully coloured soft corals on our reefs. So the coral shown here, this is a yellow zoanthid, so relatives of the anemones and other corals that grows in this big colonial sheet. And here's an example here of what we call a Gorgonian coral, so this feather-like structure. So these animals belong to groups that are also found in quite high diversity in the tropics, and they are relatives of the reef-forming corals and important. So things that are important on places like the Great Barrier Reef, but they're also quite abundant down here. And the way these things work is they have mouths like an anemone or something like that you can see here, and they'll actively reach out and catch prey from the water. So if you look at the feather-like structure of this Gorgonian coral here, this is all an individual animal, and this coral is a little mouth that will snatch food out of the water. We also have a range of really important but lesser known animals. So a really important animal is a bryozoan. This is an example of one species here called Bugula dentata, but there's many species of these. And so these are small animals that often look like plants or mosses or things like that. They're sometimes called moss animals, but it's actually an animal, and the structure is made up of small little single kind of capsules of animals with a little individual in there with tentacles. And this capsule that we call a zooid is stacked on top of itself to form these large colonies of these filter feeding animals. And these can have a range of shapes. They can look bushy, like a little bush, what we call an arborescent bryozoan. They can form these big encrusting sheets, and then they can also be crustose or erect growth forms where they look something like a coral. And so the last kind of major group of sessile animals is what we call an Acidian. So Acidians are our closest invertebrate relative. The reason for that is that their offspring, when they reproduce, is like a little tadpole, and it has a notochord, and everything that's a vertebrate, when at some point in its development, has a notochord. So we know they're our closest invertebrate, but they don't have a backbone, so they're not a vertebrate. And so these creatures are kind of wild. They just have two openings that pull water through the digestive system and push it out, and they extract food like that. They have a heart and little organs, not that dissimilar to some of their vertebrate relatives. One thing that's neat that these things can do is you can have example here is this is a group of solitary Acidians, and so each one of these club-like structures is one individual, but it's quite common to also have ones that live totally on their own, isolated by themselves, completely solitary, and then really colonial ones that can look quite different. So each of these individuals forms a really integrated colony. And so they almost look like, if you touch them underwater, they've got this kind of slimy, soft texture. They'll often look like a large sheet, and some of them have really ornate, beautiful coloration. And so the interesting aspect of these creatures from the perspective of diversity is that they're very distantly related to each other. So each of these groups of animals has evolved from a very ancient and distantly related animal lineage, and they've all kind of landed on a similar way of living, which is attached to a surface. And that represents a really important aspect of the diversity on our reefs. So again, sponge gardens are also really important habitat for large mobile macroinvertebrates, and some of these are found often only or most commonly in sponge garden. And so this includes invertebrates like the large sea stars. So here are a couple of examples here: mosaic sea star and the ocellate sea star. So you do find these in a range of habitats, but these are generally found in the greatest abundance on sponge garden reefs compared to, say, kelp forest. And there are some species that are found almost exclusively in the sponge gardens. So here they're carnivores, and they feed on both the sessile and mobile animals, as well as dead and dying ones. So they have a really important role in that ecosystem of almost like the carrion feeders on land, of helping deal with dead and dying stuff. Related to them are this cool group of animals called the feather stars. So these are related to sea stars, but instead of arms like the 5 arms you can see on these sea star, their arms have become this feather-like structure, and they use that to pull food out of the water. They love to live like hidden and embedded in the cracks and crevices in our reef systems, but they are actually capable of movement. So I don't have a good photo of the body here, but if you follow the tentacles down, there's a dish-shaped body with these little legs that cling onto the rock. And if these things get really spooked, they can jump out. They can even swim by flapping these arms to get away. And this orange feather star is really common to see, really dense aggregations of these in the sponge gardens of our reef, kind of slowly waving their arms. Really weird, cool animal. Another relative that's quite common to our sponge garden habitats, relative of the sea stars and the feather star, are what we call a basket star. So these also have modified arms that they put out into the water and pull water back and feed. But the neat thing about a lot of basket stars is it's really common to see them living on things like the soft coral. So this is an example of a soft coral here, and on top of sponges, kind of living, just hanging out on top of them. So those sessile animals are really important habitat for creatures like this. And then, of course, there are many species of brightly coloured sea slugs in our sponge gardens, far too numerous to go through here. And here are just a couple of common examples that we see. And the neat thing about the nudibranchs is that they often have really specialised relationships with their prey species. So for example, this yellow and blue nudibranch here, Vircho's nudibranch, feeds almost exclusively on this bryozoan that you can see below it. And so if you want to find these things, look for this bryozoan and you'll most likely find it. Similarly down here, this orange spotted nudibranch is found almost exclusively on these pinky purple sponges that belong to the genus Darwinia. And it feeds and lives on them and often don't move very far. They'll just find a nice colony to live on and live there munching away on it until it's gone and move on to the next. And the neat thing about them is when they reproduce, their offspring are like tiny little swimming things that look quite different to the adults that'll swim away, that we call larvae. And those larvae are actually quite good at smelling their way back to a particular species that they feed and prey on. So the larvae will swim around, and when they smell this sponge or bryozoan or whatever other species they're interested in, that'll be a cue for them to settle, and they'll undergo metamorphosis and start transforming into something that looks more like these adult nudibranchs. And so, of course, there are a number of fishes that are quite characteristic of our sponge gardens. So these species are all quite mobile, so it's not uncommon to also see them up, playing around in the algae. But the examples I'm going to show here are the ones that are most often seen in the sponge gardens, and they particularly like to hang out in the overhangs and caves that are also home to sponge gardens. So a couple of the key examples of these is this southern blue devilfish. So really spectacular fish to see underwater with its colouring and the expression on its face, the yellow eyes. They're often seen in caves with this yellow zoanthid behind it. And that's really because they both the zoanthid and the blue devil like that same sort of cave environment. So the neat thing about blue devils is that they're quite a long-lived species. We tend to find them on the deeper reefs, and they can live up to and over 40 years. So that, to me, that's quite interesting to think that some of these individuals that we find, quite common to see this in Port Phillip Heads, for example, have been there since before we created our marine protected areas. And one of the questions I ask as a scientist is how have things changed since we created them, and some of these creatures potentially have witnessed this change, but unfortunately they can't tell me what that means for them easily anyway. Another neat example is what we call a southern hula fish. So this little fish forms these huge schools, really common to find in overhangs. They're called a hula fish because they do this cool little, cute little hula dance when you see them swimming around. We also have things like the big scale bullseye, which you see often in quite large schools moving through the cave system and the underwater sponges. And then, of course, there's a whole huge diversity of carnivorous fishes, particularly those that feed on invertebrates, the invertebrores in our sponge gardens. And this is just one example that's quite common to sponge gardens, the six-spine leatherjacket. But there's a huge diversity, again, of these predatory mobile fish, and they tend to move, like I've said before, between the kelp and the sponge garden. But as you'll see, they do love sponge garden. So again, when you put all this together, here's a little video to show you what our sponge gardens look like. So this is quite common, what you see in overhangs in Victoria, I should say. The vibrant kind of colour you're seeing here is quite common to see when you're diving, and I think often far more colourful than what you see on somewhere like the Great Barrier Reef. Tons of fish make this place their home. Yeah, and just really beautiful, vibrantly colourful reefs that form these extensive kind of complicated habitat. Those are some really dominated by sponge gardens. Here's the blue devilfish here. And yeah, here's a nice swim over of some really colourful sponge gardens. You get these extensive meadows of this yellow zoanthid in some areas. These are Gorgonian fan corals hanging out down here. Here's an example of one of those basket stars living on a Gorgonian coral with its tentacle out feeding. Little sea perch here. And you can see lots of these fish that are ducking around, lots of different species that are all using these caves and crevices and the habitat provided by the sponge garden. So one of the important features of reef ecosystems in relation to our biodiversity is that they are the biodiversity hotspots in our marine environment. So the maps I'm showing you here were produced by our research partners at Deakin University, and they show species richness. And species richness is basically just a count of the number of species that you find on a habitat, and it's a really common measure of biodiversity. And this shows where species richness is distributed in Discovery Bay, Point Addis and Cape Howe Marine National Park. Red is high, blue is low. And the neat thing about this is these areas that are high that you can see here correspond really strongly to where you get reef ecosystem, whereas blue is where you have the soft, sandy, sedimenty habitats. So this is just an example of how important reef systems are in terms of supporting species richness, and that's just one measure of biodiversity. So, of course, the other major ecosystem type in our marine environment are the sandy plains, and those ecosystems that are made of sands and sediments. So often these ecosystems look like this, like a vast sandy plain that stretches on for miles. And these are by far the most widespread ecosystems in our environment. However, they're not all bare sandy plains. So in shallower waters, these areas are often dominated by the seagrasses. Seagrasses form these dense meadows of flowering plants that are home to a unique diversity of mobile invertebrates and fish. They have lots of snails, sea slugs, crabs, and other crustaceans that are found there that are different again from what we see in the kelp forest and in the sponge gardens. And they're also really important nurseries for a range of fish species, and many whose juvenile fish will actually settle and grow to size in the seagrass and before they leave when they're old enough and go and join adult populations that range more widely across the sea. So even in areas that are just plain sediments, there can be abundant life. So for example, there are a wide range of mollusks like this snail, wavy volute, that live on or in sediments and feed on other creatures or on the sediments themselves. It's quite common to see large aggregations of things like crustaceans, things like this spider crab that many will be familiar for. So soft sediments, really important habitat for these creatures when they're undergoing molting and reproducing. There's also common to see large aggregations of creatures like this heart urchin, so related to the sea urchin and the sea stars, but modified to live on sandy habitats, and they're deposit feeders, so they'll actually ingest lots of the sediment, and from that they'll extract the algae, the plants, and the small animals that are living in that sediment for nutrients. And then we have interesting habitats on the soft sediment. So this is actually what you call a rhodolith bed. These are plants. So this is a red algae that forms a kind of calcified structure. So it's a calcifying red algae. The pink is the photosynthetic cells, and they effectively form like these living rubble beds, and they can be really extensive. And it's a really important habitat. It creates what could sometimes be a flat, featureless, sandy surface. This adds a lot of really important three-dimensional structure to the seafloor, and lots of little creatures can live in there. Can be really important nurseries for other creatures to move on. And so, excuse me, even though the sandy plains often look bare, they're full of life that's adapted to the sandy environment. And many of the creatures on the sandy plains travel and move large distances across those reefs. And that's why it can make it look empty, because sometimes you can look and things aren't there. But if you look at the right time, you can see lots of the creatures in this habitat. And so the footage I'm just going to play here is from a monitoring technique that our research partners at Deakin University use to help monitor our parks, called a BRUV. It's a baited remote underwater video. It's basically a camera with a bag of bait that sits out the front. It attracts the fish, and then we can count them and identify them and work out habitat preferences, how many fish there are, the size of fish and things like that. And so I'll just play this again. What you can see here is a really nice example of the types of fish that you find in our sandy environment. So you've got these flat-shaped fish like the flathead here, and these fiddleray, which are really modified to feed on the sandy floor and on the bottom. And then you have these silvery kind of schooling fish like this silver trevally at the top there, and they're kind of modified to be very difficult to see on these sandy plains. That silver color blends in quite easily with the water, and so it makes them hard for predators to see them. So one interesting pattern in some of the studies we've been doing when we're thinking about biodiversity is, as one measure of biodiversity I talked about was species richness, another is biomass, and biomass is basically a way to measure how much life there is. It's just the weight of all the animals that you count in an area. And so when we looked at the PROM, Wilson's PROM, what we found is that similar patterns that on reef you have the highest species richness, but on sandy plains we have much higher biomass, and that means so we might have lots more species on the reefs, but they're smaller, and perhaps there's not as many of them compared to the land. And so one of the reasons that you see this pattern of high biomass on sandy sediments is because of things like this. So I'll just play this video here, but often the species that contribute the most biomass are things like these large predators like sharks and rays. And this is an example of a 7-gill shark that you can see feeding on one of our BRUV baits here. But you also get lots of big schooling fish that travel large distances in search of food and prey in our sandy habitats. And so that's why you get this high biomass there. And so it goes to show, depending on how you look at biodiversity, each of these habitats makes a really important contribution to the different measures of biodiversity. And yeah, I love this video. This 7-gill just reminds me of like a little dog or something with a rope or a chew toy. So what I've described to you so far is how Victoria's marine biodiversity shifts across the major ecosystem types. And so that pattern of shifting as you go down the depth and between rock and sand are broadly found across the whole state. However, the species that we find in them can differ quite notably as we move to east to west, from east to west across the state. So, for example, there are a range of, excuse me, I'm just going to cough. Sorry about that. There are a range of species that are primarily found in the eastern part of the state and commonly to the east of Wilson's Promontory. And these are just some examples of that here. So things like the blue groper, one-spot puller, this eastern hula fish, as well as invertebrates. So some classic examples of this are the long-spine sea urchin, Central Stephanus, and the tent turban, which have a really eastern distribution in our state. And that's because these species have a preference for the temperate warmer waters of eastern Australia, and it's really common, the distribution of those eastern species, to go all the way up the New South Wales coast, and in some cases as far as the southern Great Barrier Reef. And so they're really influenced by that famous current, the East Australia current that everyone knows from Finding Nemo, that runs down the side of Australia and penetrates into some parts of eastern Victoria. And it's actually increasing to penetrate into Victoria under climate change. So we're expecting to see more of these eastern species moving west as waters warm up. On the other hand, there are a range of species that have a more western distribution in Victoria. So some common examples of this are some of the species that I showed you earlier. So things like the southern blue devil, the scaly fin, the horseshoe leather jacket, the southern hula fish, and the giant kelp all have a really western distribution, typically west of the Prom, and they have a much stronger preference for the cooler water that we find in central and western Victoria. So unlike the east, which gets fed by the warmer East Australian current, in the west you get our currents coming up from the Southern Ocean and in from the west, with lots of upwelling in the far west of the state. And so these creatures like that cooler climate. So I guess another important aspect of Victoria's marine biodiversity from the perspective of our marine national parks is how that varies and has been captured inside our marine national parks. So there's quite a diversity in the way that ecosystems and habitats are found across our marine protected area system. So for example, some of our parks are really dominated by one major habitat type. So here in Corner Inlet, seagrass almost completely dominates the whole habitat. It's this extensive area of seagrass beds underwater. Likewise, at 90 Mile Beach, it's basically just a large sandy plain. So really just got the one sort of habitat there. If we go somewhere like Port Phillip Heads, however, this is our most complex marine national park with a really diverse system of reef, seagrass and habitat. So in Swan Bay, which is part of that marine national park, this is all extensive seagrass beds here. If you go down into the Port Phillip Heads region of the national park, it has these really extensive canyon systems with rocky reef. It's got that algal reef in the shallow areas and really amazing walls that are covered with sponge gardens all through there. And this really deep area is where the Yarra River used to flow when sea levels were lower. And so it's this amazingly complex canyon system full of different creatures. And you got places like Portsea Hole as well that have these vertical walls and this sponge garden reef. So that's a park that really captures a range of habitat types. When you actually look in individual parks, the configuration and the amount of the different type of ecosystems can vary quite strongly. So if we go to Wilson's Prom, for example, this is a map of Wilson's Prom and the different colours correspond to the different habitat types. This is some work that we've done with Deakin University to do some really detailed mapping of this park. And the colours, the names are here, and I won't go into too much detail. They're a bit esoteric, but these maps give us a really strong idea of the distribution of the different habitat types across the Proms Park. So in the yellow sort of browny colours, these are extensive sandy plains. If we look at these blue areas, these are these deeper but quite vertical rocky structures that come up that are covered in this sponge garden reef. And then if you look close to the actual land part of the Prom, a lot of the shallow reef here is dominated by seaweeds and algae. So effectively, the way to describe the Prom is an area of vast sandy plains that's then punctuated by these really these islands of sponge garden and algal reef that are really high diversity, as well as the fringing kelp reef. So that's how that park's configured. Now, if we go to somewhere nearby, like Bunurong Marine National Park, it's quite a different configuration and habitat types that we find in that park. So this is again another map of Bunurong Marine National Park. The green here corresponds to the brown algal, kind of macroalgal dominated reef, like those canopy forming reefs that I described earlier. If you start to get deeper, this grey area are these really extensive areas of red algae. So there's dense red algal beds. It's slightly deeper. The reef aspect is just the right amount. The red algae love it. And then if you move further out here, this brown area are all these rhodolith beds. So if you remember from earlier slides, those kind of rock-like plants. And so what you have in somewhere like Bunurong is effectively like more like an underwater garden full of diverse plant life, very different from the sandy plains at the Prom. And so the benefit of having this diversity of ecosystem types and configuration is that each of these parks supports slightly different examples of biodiversity. And it means that throughout our network, we're capturing a range of different configurations, and it maximises the diversity we have in our parks. So I'm just looking at the time, so I better hurry things up a bit. It looks like we might go over time, everyone, I apologise. But for the next part of the webinar, I just want to change direction a little. So we're now coming up on 20 years of our marine national parks and sanctuaries. And this has meant that we've been thinking at Parks Victoria a lot about how they performed over the years. So if you remember, their main goal was to protect and preserve biodiversity for future generations. So, whoops, sorry about that. I bumped the wheel of my mouse. And so we've been undertaking monitoring for the past 20 years, and that's meant lately we've been able to do some really good assessments of how biodiversity is tracking in our marine national parks. So one of the simplest measures of biodiversity I talked about earlier is species richness, and one of the neat patterns that we find in our marine national parks is that we tend to find much higher species richness of fish and much higher species richness of diversity. Because these are in different reports, they've swapped here, but this is in parks, and higher invertebrate richness and higher fish species richness in parks. And this is a complete statewide assessment. So this is when we aggregate all the numbers up, when we look at everything that's in our entire network. And so when we compare the differences in species inside our parks, it gives us inside and outside our parks, it gives us a good idea of how well we're protecting them. And so by finding that higher richness inside our parks, is a good indication that our parks are providing benefit to biodiversity through that protection, because we have that higher species richness inside them. And so that higher richness is also likely to reflect that greater level of protection the parks have afforded them through the no-take protection they get, as well as potentially mean that we have good habitat that's protected inside those parks. Similarly, we've also been able to follow the population of a range of key fish and invertebrate species, both inside and outside our parks, for over 20 years. And this has allowed us to follow the long-term trends of species and compare how they're tracking inside and outside. So this blue throat wrasse shown here is a really good example of a species that's benefited from marine national parks. It's one of the most common and widespread fish in Victoria, so it's a really good one to track. The plots here are what we call a control chart, an ecological control chart. So essentially green is good numbers, orange is okay, not so good, and red means we've got a problem. The black bars are inside our marine national parks, the grey bars are outside. And I guess what we've seen with this species is that we tend to find it has higher numbers inside some of our major marine parks, and its numbers have also increased since the parks were created. So again, indicating good protection for those species in our parks. This isn't always the case. So down here is Wilson's Promontory Marine National Park. And what we find is relatively similar, sometimes lower inside and outside of the park at Wilson's Prom, but definitely varies over time. And that can indicate that really for something like the Prom, it's probably isolated and a bit more remote, and fishing pressure is perhaps not such an issue there, or perhaps there's some nice habitat outside the park that we didn't capture. So not such strong differences there for the blue throat wrasse. But in general, we see this is a species that really benefits in a lot of our major marine parks. And this is true for a range of other fish species that generally have higher abundances inside our marine national parks, and they occur in healthy numbers. So some key examples of those species that we've seen are things like the scaly fin, the yellow striped leatherjacket, there's a horseshoe leatherjacket here, and the sea sweep. They all tend to have higher numbers inside our marine national parks than outside. And for many of them, we've also seen a good increase. I guess one pattern we see is that our fish are generally in good health. There's good numbers inside our marine protected areas. So again, another really good indication that our marine protected areas have been effective at protecting these species. And are doing their job where they've been set up. It's a similar story for some of the larger mobile macroinvertebrates. So we've been doing studies of southern rock lobster, which is an ecologically really important species, and we've been finding really good evidence of the benefits of parks for them. So just two examples are from Point Addis Marine National Park and from Cape Howe. And what we did is we compared southern rock lobster inside the park to outside the park, measured their size and numbers. And what these plots show here is the weight at the top and or the size and the number. Black is outside the park, grey is inside the park, and I guess just to summarise, we generally saw much higher numbers inside the park and larger individuals at both Point Addis and Cape Howe. So again, showing that protection is really benefiting these species. And what's really neat about that, for something like a rock lobster, when it reproduces, it produces little swimming babies that will live in the water for up to 2 years, and they can disperse really far. They can potentially disperse from one side of Victoria to the other. So that means we're protecting really important source populations where the offspring of these species can go and disappear outside of the park and replenish other populations on quite remote reefs. We've seen similar patterns to this with abalone. So this is an example of the green lip abalone from Port Phillip Heads National Park, where again, we're finding high numbers of that species inside our park and a general increase in the numbers of that abalone since the park was created. So suggesting that for species like abalone, the marine protected areas are also providing good benefit for them. But that's not the case everywhere. So in contrast, for some species, we are seeing signs of decline and trouble. So for the black lip abalone, for example, we've generally seen a long-term decline in this species over time. And this pattern is happening across a lot of the western part of the state. We've seen it at Port Phillip Heads, Point Addis, and at Wilson's Prom. One thing to note is that we've also seen a decline outside the parks as well as inside. So it's not necessarily suggesting there's a problem with what's going on inside the parks, but more that this is a long-term statewide trend. And we've done some bigger analyses that have confirmed that. However, not always the case at Cape Howe, the typo there, but at Cape Howe, a bit more of a complicated story in those waters where it's been good in many years, it's currently quite good, and it's bounced up and down. So with everything, it's not necessarily always doom and gloom. There is a complex story happening, but certainly we're seeing signs of decline there, which is something to pay attention to. And I think perhaps one of the more concerning patterns for biodiversity that we're seeing across the state is a really broad scale and general decline in the large canopy forming brown algal species across the state. So we've recently completed monitoring at Point Addis, Port Phillip Heads, Wilson's Prom, that has shown a long-term decline in some of the major kelp species here. And you can see these on these figures, quite a significant decline, particularly for Aclonia radiata. For the crayweed, the patterns are not as serious, and it's bounced back in some areas. But then when we look at other canopy forming brown algae, certainly in Point Addis, we've seen a decline, and at Wilson's Prom for some key species, we've seen a decline. But again, it's a complicated story. In some parks like Port Phillip Heads Marine National Park, things have started to bounce back recently. But nevertheless, we've completed a more comprehensive statewide analysis, which is showing that there's quite a significant decline of brown algae across the state. And this is because of different reasons. So we can attribute this on the East Coast pretty easily. We know that this is because of the action of overabundant urchins, which are expanding in their range and they're eating a lot of the algae. On the West Coast, where we're seeing quite a lot of these declines, it's not really clear what that is, but it's likely to be linked to increasing sea surface temperatures and climate change in those areas. Southern Australia is a climate change hotspot. Our waters have warmed by about 1 degree. Which is quite significant in these creatures, and kelp are known to be quite sensitive to temperatures. So this is like a really important issue, something that we need to talk about and think about when we're working out the future of our parks and making decisions about how we manage them, understanding where there are refuges for kelp and understanding where there are areas where it's in decline and how we best manage that. Okay, so that brings my webinar to an end. I think I've got there just in time. So just to wrap up, I think just want to say that I think one of the major challenges we face in marine conservation in Victoria is really the lack of awareness of just how good and how special Victoria's marine biodiversity is. It's really unique, it's diverse, and it's colourful. So there's a couple of key things I hope you can take away from this webinar. And that's that Victoria does have a spectacular, unique, and valuable marine biodiversity, and it's really important that we protect this biodiversity so that future generations of Victorians can marvel at it and see it in the best state possible. So after 20 years, our marine national parks appear to have been quite effective for protecting biodiversity inside their boundaries, but there still are challenges that we need to continue there are still challenges that we need to continue to manage, and our marine protected areas provide a really important opportunity to be able to help address future changes like climate change. So thanks everyone for listening. And the last thing I'd just like to say before I wrap up is I've used a whole lot of photographs throughout these and none of them are mine. So I just want to acknowledge a couple of the photographers and videographers. So a lot of the photo credits belong to Parks Victoria and taken by staff around the state. too numerous to name here. We also used a lot of images from Museum Victorian, in particular Julian Finn at Museum Victoria and Mark Norman's photos have featured pretty heavily here. Tess Hohenville, who works with Media Parks Victoria, has provided some of our own photos, some of the really good ones, like the one you can see back here. And I also had to pinch a couple from an organisation called Reef Life Survey that we work for, where I just couldn't find some examples of the species I wanted to talk about. And most of the videos are ours, and we've recently had some work done by a guy called Jack Breeden, which was some of those really nice videos. And so that's it for me. So thanks very much for listening.
Wow, Michael, that was just absolutely sensational. Hear the voice of Lord God coming in for those of you listening. Because I think it was Jing Yang made a comment in the chat. We've been looking at what an amazing, the most eye-catching Teams meeting that she's ever that they've ever attended. So congratulations, Michael, and what a wonderful expose. Not only looking at the animals, the plants themselves, but also the important role that marine national parks, marine sanctuaries, and other protected areas play in ensuring that Victoria's incredible marine biodiversity is maintained now and into the future. You'll be pleased to know, Michael, there's been quite a few questions. I'm not sure we're going to get a chance to answer all of them this afternoon, this evening, and we might just keep it to probably another 3 or 4 minutes for those of you who need to go and get the dinner ready for the kids or whatever else next on your agenda for tonight. That's possibly you too, Michael. But certainly in terms of a couple of the questions, one came in fairly early from Jennifer. It was what's the main reasons for the cause of decline in giant kelp?
Yes, so it's a really, really good question. There's 2 main reasons. One, we've got a pretty good handle on, and that's the expansion of overabundant urchins across the state. So in Port Phillip Bay in the east of the state, we've seen, I'll break this down a bit. Across the east of the state, we've got the long-spined urchin, which is slowly moving west. So that's some of the species you normally find on the east coast. But because waters have warmed, and because the East Australia currents come into Eastern Victoria more, it's started to expand its range, and that is just a voracious feeder of kelp when the conditions are right. So we're losing kelp because they're basically eating them away. Similar story with a different species in Port Phillip Bay. The purple urchins become quite abundant, and it's eating its way through the bay effectively. So that's what's happening there. In the West Coast, it's a little bit less clear, and we're doing some work to investigate that. We've just completed some work recently with Deacon, which is really showing the main drivers of that kelp loss are increases in temperature as well as increases in wave energy, which comes with is something that comes as the climate's changing. So greater water temperatures and more wind as well, because things are warmer, can create greater wave energy, and so that's more what's driving that loss on the west coast. In like Tasmania, if we want to talk more broadly, that's been partly due to increasing water temperatures as well as changes in nutrients that are in the water that are often associated with that increase in water temperature, as well as they're being eaten by urchins too, I should say. So they've got the issues with the long spine urchin down there.
Thank you very much. So a question from Angus Cooper. Thanks for the question, Angus. What can we do about marine invasive species? Is there anything that we as a community or as individuals, boat owners, swimmers, divers, snorkelers do to stop the scourge of marine invasives in Victoria?
Yeah, there's a number of things you can do. I guess one easy one is if you see them and see new ones you haven't identified and you're able to identify that, is to report them. So Mark, I might have to get you to put in the chat the best way to report them, but we've got colleagues at Biosecurity where we can report invasive species. That's one thing to do. A really important thing to do is, I guess we have a program that's been put in place which is called Check, Clean, Dry. So one of the best ways to prevent species from moving around is to check that they're not attached to your vessel, or if you're catching things in the water that you haven't picked them up, and then removing them where you have picked them up, and dry, obviously, because that kills most of them. So getting them out of the water and making sure that we're not actively transporting them around the state. For people who own vessels, I guess keeping hulls and things like that clean, because that's a really common vector for them to spread around, is they attach to the hulls of vessels and then they get moved between places. So keeping vessel hulls clean, not taking them, if you're going to move between places, making sure that you don't have invasive species fouling them are probably the key ones. But it's a good question for you too, Mark. Did I miss anything there? What's you on mute, I think?
Yes, thanks, Michael. That's absolutely right. I was on mute, but certainly the other thing to be mindful of is just knowing what an invasive species actually looks like. If you go to Parks Victoria's website or the Marine Pest section of the Department of Jobs Precincts and Regions or BagVic, you'll be able to get guides as to what the invasive species we have in Victoria look like as well. So knowing the difference between native and introduced species can sometimes be a challenge. It is important, obviously, that you recognise and not do any sort of what we might call vigilante kind of culling of your own beliefs about marine invasives. That has been a problem in the past where native species have been misidentified as marine pests. The beautiful 11-armed sea star you showed in the earlier pictures is a good example of that, where around some piers and jetties these were being removed by very good-meaning, well-intentioned people, but they were actually removing one of the predators of the invasive species. So, yeah, know what you're looking at is probably a good thing to remember as well. A couple of other ones quickly before we let you go. There's a couple of questions which are probably a little bit challenging to ask. Someone's asking a question from Kerry about the seaweed that's washing up on the beach at Altona. What would that be? Do you want to have a crack at that one? I think there's probably going to be a bit of a mixed bag of algae there.
Well, yeah, I can have a bit of a crack. So around there's a really interesting part of the bay. It's there's what we have these drift algal beds. So it's a combination of red and green algae, lots of different species. I don't know if you're talking about, without seeing it, I can't really say, but that is what commonly washes up at Altona. It's that drift algae, and that yeah, is a complicated mixture that kind of isn't living attached to the reef, just floating around there. And when the tides are right, it pushes it on to the bay.
Yeah, good. It's a good attempt there. For something
it's the best I can do without seeing it. Yep.
But no doubt, when you in your former roles, you spent a bit of time in that northern section of the bay.
Yep.
Here's a question relates to, it's probably more of a proposal than anything else. Is there any way that we could mark the perimeters of our suburban marine sanctuaries with buoys? Sites like Ricketts Point and Jawbone often get fished as people claim they aren't aware of borders. Could these sanctuaries be marked similar to protected areas in the Whitsundays? Do you want to have a bit of a discussion around how do people know where they are in relation to our marine national parks or marine sanctuaries?
Sure, yeah, well, it is really important. So I suppose there's a couple of tools, and again, this is one that you can jump in on, Mark, because you know this well, but we do have marker buoys out that do identify where the parks are, and you can use them to reference. But I think Mark and I probably agree that sometimes that can be challenging when you're standing from shore to work out whether you're in and out. There's another really nice app, Mark, jump in because I get the name wrong, that Victorian Fisheries Authority have put together, and we've provided the maps for, where you can actually use an app on your phone that has the GPS, your GPS location, and will show the map up, just like, you know, if you're using Google Maps or something like that. And that can be a really effective way for people to know more specifically where they are. Obviously, we can't put a big fence around the park in the ocean, so those marker buoys are the way that we do it. But having an app like that can really help you be much more certain about whether you're inside or outside a park.
Yeah, that's great response there, Michael. And again, just to add to that, the app we're talking about here is actually the Victorian Recreational Fishing Guide app. It's a great tool. We were very delighted. One of our rangers actually suggested, probably about 12 years ago now, wouldn't it be great if you could press a button on a phone and work out whether you're next to, a long way away from, or right inside a marine national park in regards fishing. And this technology, we're very proud at Parks Victoria. This is actually the first time this has actually been developed anywhere in the world. But if you use the Recreational Fishing Guide, you'll find there's a section there called Can I Fish Here? It's a very simple tool. The majority of people probably have a smart device of some sort in their pockets or on their boats, and it's a very easy one to be able to use the GPS built into the phone system or the devices system to locate yourself in relation to the boundary, and it'll give you a very clear yes you can fish or no you can't fish message in response. But look, it is a great question. I appreciate that sometimes there are challenges of identifying boundaries. Shorelines are well marked, easy to mark. When we get particularly to some of our bigger offshore parks, it's incredibly difficult to put infrastructure out there. The depth of water, the environmental conditions out there just are simply too powerful to be able to think about putting permanent markers in there. So we rely on people, fishers, being responsible for their own activity, knowing where they are, which they should do if they're on a boat anyway, and using tools like our Recreational Fishing Guide app to locate themselves in relation to the park boundaries. Michael, I think unfortunately we're going to have to leave it there because it's already 6:10, and I know your children are hungry, and My belly's getting a bit full, getting a bit that way also. But look, just again on behalf of everybody who's joined us tonight, we had a good audience, and I know there'll be many people watching this in the recording mode after the event. Thank you so much for what we've talked about today. Just for myself in closing, I want to thank you all for coming along this evening and joining us as part of our 20th year anniversary webinar series. I'll put a big plug in. We do actually have another 3 webinars to run, one next month in October, which will be a fantastic opportunity to hear from some of the volunteers that are actually working with agencies like Parks Victoria to help protect their local environment. And some of our friends from Beware Reef, some of our friends at Ricketts Point, some of our friends down on the West Coast will be joining us for a presentation essentially on what volunteers can and do actually do in relation to looking after their own particular park. So join us next month for that one. We've got again another 2 coming after that, and more details of those will be available in the email that I'll send you shortly. Also want to encourage you, if you have enjoyed tonight's presentation and exploring this aspect of Victoria's incredible biodiversity, is to jump onto the Victorian Nature Festival website and have a look at some of the other great activities that are happening across the state. Many organisations including Parks Victoria, Royal Botanical Gardens, Department of Environment, Zoos Victoria, and many others are providing some online opportunities as well as some actual face-to-face personal experience opportunities. So please, if you're enjoying and you want to know more about the incredible diversity and the wonderful nature of Victoria, have a bit more look at what's happening there in the Victorian Nature Festival. But then just to finish off, thank you again for joining us. We hope you've enjoyed the presentation. The recording of this presentation will be made available on Parks Victoria's website. We have a landing page for our Marine National Parks 20th anniversary. The previous webinars, as I put in the chat earlier on, are all available there online, and you can join, you can revisit Michael and come back and watch him again another time, or alternatively have a look at some of the other wonderful offerings that we've provided to date. So thank you again for joining us, and look forward to joining you again next month for our 20th anniversary webinar series. Bye for now.